If you walk through the financial district of London today, you will see the Bank of England standing at the corner of Threadneedle Street and Bartholomew Lane, a fortress of Portland stone that has anchored British monetary policy since 1694. You will see the Royal Exchange across the street, where merchants once traded goods from every corner of the empire. You will see monuments to British financial power built during centuries when the pound sterling was the currency of global commerce. But what you will not see is any acknowledgement of the decision made in that building on April 28, 1925, a choice that destroyed British industry, threw millions out of work, and guaranteed that the 20th century would belong to America rather than Britain. In 1925, Britain stood at a crossroads. Nation had emerged victorious from the First World War, but economically weakened by 4 years of industrial slaughter that consumed wealth faster than British factories could produce it. The empire remained intact, stretching across a quarter of the globe. The Royal Navy still ruled the seas. British banks still financed international trade. But beneath this facade of continued dominance, the economic foundations were cracking. British industry faced new competitors in America, Germany, and Japan. British workers demanded higher wages and better conditions. British exports struggled to find markets. The country needed economic flexibility and pragmatic adaptation to changed circumstances. They chose the opposite. They believed restoring the pound sterling to its pre-war value against gold would restore British prestige and economic supremacy. They assumed that monetary policy could reverse the structural changes wrought by 4 years of total war. They did not realize that the decision to return to the gold standard at the old parity would strangle British exports, devastate British industry, and condemn millions of workers to unemployment that would last a generation. They forgot that currencies reflect economic reality rather than create it, and that trying to maintain an overvalued currency through sheer determination is like trying to defy gravity through force of will. This is the story of how one financial decision crippled Britain for a generation. Winston Churchill, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, made a choice in 1925 that he would later call the greatest mistake of his political career. This is the birth of Britain's long economic decline. It is the original sin of British monetary policy, proof that prestige and reality are not the same thing, and that nations which sacrifice their workers on the altar of currency values pay a terrible price. To understand how Britain destroyed its own economy through monetary policy, we must return to the world before 1914, to the golden age of the classical gold standard. For nearly a century before the First World War, the pound sterling had been convertible to gold at a fixed rate of 4.86 pounds per ounce, a ratio that had remained unchanged since Isaac Newton set it in 1717, when he served as master of the Royal Mint. This stability was not merely a technical arrangement, but the foundation of British economic power and the mechanism through which London maintained its position as the financial center of the world. The economic engine that powered British dominance rested on this monetary bedrock. Because the pound was reliably convertible to gold, merchants and bankers worldwide trusted it as a store of value and medium of exchange. International trade was denominated in sterling. Foreign governments held reserves in pounds. Colonial territories used currencies pegged to the pound. The City of London financed global commerce through short-term credits that facilitated trade between nations that never touched British shores. A merchant in Buenos Aires selling beef to a buyer in Hamburg would arrange payment through London banks in pounds sterling, even though Britain was not party to the transaction. This invisible empire of finance generated enormous profits for British banks and cemented the pound's role as the currency of international commerce. But beneath this surface of monetary supremacy lay assumptions that the First World War would shatter completely. British policymakers believed the gold standard was natural and permanent, as fundamental to economic order as gravity was to the physical world. They assumed that maintaining gold convertibility at the traditional parity was not merely desirable, but essential to British power and prestige. They did not realize they were living through a unique historical moment when British industrial supremacy, naval dominance, and financial sophistication combined to create monetary stability that appeared natural, but was actually contingent on specific circumstances that were already disappearing. The character who would guide Britain into this disaster was Winston Spencer Churchill, who became Chancellor of the Exchequer in November 1924 at the age of 50. Churchill was born into aristocracy at Blenheim Palace in 1874, the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, and grandson of the Duke of Marlborough. He had made his reputation as a soldier, war correspondent, and politician rather than as an economist or financier. His previous government positions included First Lord of the Admiralty and Secretary of State for War, roles that required strategic thinking about military power rather than technical knowledge of monetary policy. Churchill understood grand strategy and geopolitical competition. He did not understand economics. Churchill realized, or more accurately was told by his advisers, that Britain's position as a great power depended on maintaining the pound's status as the premier international currency. He understood that prestige mattered in international affairs, and that a strong currency was both a symbol and an instrument of national strength. This was not economic analysis. It was strategic intuition applied to a domain where intuition was dangerous and technical details mattered enormously. Churchill believed that restoring the pre-war gold parity would restore pre-war British dominance, a confusion of cause and effect that would prove catastrophic. The system that existed before 1914 had worked precisely because it reflected underlying economic reality. Britain had been the most productive industrial nation on Earth, the largest exporter of manufactured goods, the dominant naval power, and the source of capital for global development. The strength of the pound reflected these fundamentals. Foreign holders of sterling knew they could convert pounds to gold because Britain generated trade surpluses that brought gold into the country faster than it flowed out. The gold standard worked because Britain's real economy supported it. The monetary arrangement was the effect, not the cause, of British economic supremacy. The vulnerability that would doom Britain's attempt to restore the old system was simple. The war had changed everything. British industry had lost markets to American and Japanese competitors who had supplied goods, while British factories produced munitions. British workers had grown accustomed to higher wages paid during the wartime labor shortage. British government debt had increased 15-fold, consuming revenue that could have financed investment. British trade surpluses had evaporated. The real economy no longer supported a pound valued at the pre-war parity. Attempting to maintain that valuation would require crushing British wages, prices, and economic activity until they fell far enough to make British exports competitive again. The cure would be worse than the disease. The first compromise came in the immediate aftermath of the war, when British authorities suspended gold convertibility rather than watch their reserves drain away. In March 1919, the gold standard was formally abandoned as a temporary wartime measure. The pound immediately depreciated against the dollar, falling from the pre-war parity of $4.86 per pound to approximately $3.4 by early 1920. This depreciation was economically healthy. It made British exports cheaper and more competitive in global markets. It reduced the real burden of British debts. It allowed the economy to adjust to changed circumstances without crushing deflation. But British policymakers viewed the depreciation as a national humiliation rather than a necessary adjustment. The fateful decision to pursue restoration emerged from a consensus among British financial and political elites that restoring the gold standard at the pre-war parity was essential to British prestige and economic recovery. The governor of the Bank of England, Montagu Norman, became the leading advocate for restoration. Norman was born in 1871 to a family of London bankers and had worked in finance his entire adult life. He believed with religious conviction that the gold standard represented financial rectitude, and that deviation from it represented moral weakness. Norman told Churchill that restoring gold convertibility at the old parity would restore confidence in British finance, attract foreign investment, and re-establish London's position at the center of the global economy. In April 1925, Churchill presented his budget to Parliament, announcing that Britain would return to the gold standard at the pre-war parity of $4.86 per pound. The decision was presented as a return to normalcy and sound finance, the restoration of the natural order disrupted by the war. But in reality, it was an act of economic self-destruction that would condemn British workers to a decade of unemployment and wage cuts. The pound was overvalued by approximately 10% compared to its market rate. British exports would become 10% more expensive overnight. British coal, textiles, steel, and ships would have to compete in global markets with prices inflated by an artificial exchange rate maintained for reasons of prestige rather than economic logic. The poisoned terms of this decision revealed themselves with brutal speed. British coal owners immediately recognized that they could not sell coal at prices dictated by the overvalued pound while paying existing wages. They demanded wage cuts of 10 to 25% to restore competitiveness. The coal miners refused. In May 1926, barely a year after the return to gold, the coal miners went on strike. The Trades Union Congress called a general strike in support, bringing out millions of workers across Britain in the largest industrial action in British history. For 9 days, trains stopped running, newspapers ceased publishing, and the British economy ground to a halt. Churchill had discovered a magic trick, though not one that worked the way he intended. With a simple policy decision announced in Parliament, he could declare British prestige restored and the pound strong. The declaration changed nothing about the underlying reality that British industry was less competitive than before the war, and that British wages were too high relative to productivity to support exports at the new exchange rate. The 1926 general strike ended in defeat for the unions, but the fundamental problem remained. Britain had chosen to maintain an overvalued currency, and someone had to pay the price. That someone would be the British working class. The spending restraint that followed was presented as fiscal responsibility, but was actually the inevitable consequence of defending an overvalued currency. The Bank of England raised interest rates to attract foreign capital and prevent gold outflows. Higher interest rates meant higher costs for businesses and less investment in new capacity. The government cut spending to balance the budget and maintain confidence among foreign holders of sterling. The austerity was not chosen for economic reasons, but imposed by the logic of the gold standard. If Britain wanted to maintain the pound at $4.86, it had to deflate wages, prices, and economic activity until British goods became competitive again. This meant unemployment, wage cuts, and stagnation. By 1928, Britain had turned economic policy into a mechanism for impoverishing its own workers to maintain a symbolic exchange rate. British coal miners earned less than they had in 1914 despite a decade of inflation. British textile workers faced wage cuts and unemployment as mills closed or reduced shifts. British steel workers watched their industry shrink as cheaper foreign steel captured markets that British producers had once dominated. The statistics were brutal. Unemployment never fell below 1 million during the entire period from 1925 to 1929, representing approximately 10% of the insured workforce. In coal mining regions and textile towns, unemployment reached 25% or higher. The escalating cost of Churchill's decision becomes clear when we examine specific industries. The British coal industry employed 1.2 million miners in 1920. By 1930, employment had fallen to under 1 million despite rising global demand for coal. British coal exports fell from 73 million tons in 1913 to 50 million tons by 1930. The difference was not declining global demand, but rising competition from German and Polish coal that was cheaper because those currencies had depreciated while the pound remained overvalued. Think about that figure. British coal miners lost their jobs not because coal was obsolete, but because Churchill insisted on maintaining a symbolic exchange rate. The human impact of this policy becomes visible when we zoom from macroeconomic statistics to individual communities. In South Wales, where coal mining dominated the economy, entire towns descended into poverty as pits closed or reduced shifts. A coal miner who had earned steady wages during the war found himself unemployed or working reduced hours at lower pay by 1926. His children went hungry. His wife pawned possessions to buy food. His community descended into destitution while policymakers in London congratulated themselves on restoring British financial prestige. 1 out of every 4 Welsh miners was unemployed by 1928. That meant no money for food, rent, or the basic necessities of life. The warning signs that this policy was unsustainable appeared immediately, but Churchill and his advisors ignored them. John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist in Britain, published pamphlets and articles arguing that returning to gold at the pre-war parity was a terrible mistake that would cause mass unemployment and industrial decline. Keynes pointed out that British costs and prices had risen during the war and could not be forced down to pre-war levels without crushing the economy. He warned that attempting to maintain an overvalued currency would require perpetual deflation that would destroy British industry and impoverish British workers. Churchill dismissed these warnings. He trusted the bankers who told him that gold and prestige mattered more than the concerns of economists and workers. The desperate measures intensified as the 1920s progressed, and Britain's competitive position continued to deteriorate. Industries lobbied for tariff protection against foreign imports, violating the free trade principles Britain had championed for a century. Workers accepted wage cuts to keep their jobs, eroding their standard of living to maintain export competitiveness. Regional economies dependent on traditional industries spiraled into depression, while the financial sector in London remained profitable, servicing international transactions. Britain was fracturing into two economies. The City of London benefited from the strong pound and restoration of gold convertibility. Industrial Britain suffered mass unemployment and decline. Churchill had sacrificed the productive economy to benefit the financial sector. The tipping point arrived in October 1929, when the Wall Street stock market crashed and triggered a global economic depression that would dwarf the difficulties Britain had already experienced. At the exact same time, the international gold standard that Britain had worked so hard to restore began to collapse as country after country abandoned convertibility to deal with the economic crisis. The global demand for British exports collapsed, but the obligation to maintain gold convertibility at the old parity remained fixed. The contradictions inherent in Churchill's 1925 decision became impossible to sustain. In September 1931, barely 6 years after Churchill's triumphant announcement of restoration, Britain abandoned the gold standard in humiliating circumstances that vindicated every warning Keynes had issued. Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England who had championed the return to gold, looked at the reserve position and realized the game was up. Foreign depositors were demanding gold. The bank's reserves were draining at rates that would exhaust them within weeks. Britain faced a choice between defending the pound through interest rates that would cause complete economic collapse or abandoning the gold standard that had been the centerpiece of British monetary policy for 2 centuries. On September 21, 1931, the British government suspended gold convertibility. In polite language, this was described as a temporary measure to address extraordinary circumstances created by the global depression. In brutal language, Britain had admitted that Churchill's decision in 1925 had been a catastrophic mistake that cost the nation 6 years of unnecessary unemployment and industrial decline. The pound immediately depreciated by 25% against gold and the dollar. British exports became cheaper overnight. British industry got the competitive relief it had needed since 1925. But the relief came 6 years too late to save the industries and communities destroyed by Churchill's insistence on maintaining an unsustainable exchange rate. The immediate reaction was relief mixed with humiliation. British industry celebrated the depreciation that made exports competitive again. British workers hoped for employment opportunities that had been crushed by the overvalued pound. But British policymakers understood they had suffered a profound defeat. The monetary policy that was supposed to restore British prestige had instead demonstrated British weakness. The gold standard that was supposed to be permanent had lasted 6 years. The decision that Churchill had presented as a return to normalcy had proven to be an aberration that cost Britain dearly. This crisis revealed the fundamental flaw in the strategy Churchill and Norman had pursued. They had believed that monetary policy could compensate for changed economic circumstances. They assumed that maintaining a strong currency would create economic strength rather than reflect it. They did not realize that attempting to maintain an overvalued currency requires crushing domestic wages and prices to restore competitiveness, and that democratic societies will not tolerate such deflation indefinitely. The gold standard worked before 1914 because it reflected British economic dominance. Attempting to restore it in the 1920s required creating economic conditions that no longer existed, and the attempt destroyed British industry in the process. The takeover did not come from foreign armies or explicit conquest. It came through the accumulated consequences of 6 years of misguided monetary policy that crippled British industry while competitors grew stronger. American industrial production increased by 40% between 1925 and 1929, while British production stagnated. German industry recovered from wartime devastation and captured markets that British producers had once dominated. Japanese exports of textiles surged as British textile mills closed. The Americans, Germans, and Japanese did not need to defeat Britain militarily. They simply needed to wait, while British policymakers defeated themselves through devotion to a monetary standard that served prestige rather than prosperity. The extraction system that emerged from this disaster was more subtle than military occupation, but just as effective in transferring wealth and power. British capital that should have financed investment in modern factories and equipment instead flowed abroad seeking higher returns in faster-growing economies. British workers who should have been producing goods for export instead sat unemployed in declining industrial regions. British industrial capacity that should have been expanding to meet growing global demand instead contracted as firms closed or moved production to countries with more sensible monetary policies. The City of London remained profitable, but British industry hemorrhaged jobs and competitiveness. The specific mechanisms of industrial decline tell the story with brutal clarity. The British cotton textile industry employed 621,000 workers in 1920. By 1938, employment had fallen to 394,000 workers despite rising global demand for textiles. The industry did not disappear because cotton became obsolete. It declined because British textile manufacturers could not compete with Japanese and Indian producers whose currencies had depreciated, while the pound remained overvalued during the critical years from 1925 to 1931. British coal exports never recovered to pre-war levels. British shipbuilding, once dominant globally, watched orders flow to German and Japanese yards that could build ships more cheaply. Between 1925 and 1931, Britain sacrificed industrial employment and capacity to maintain a symbolic exchange rate that benefited financial interests while destroying productive industry. This meant that, when the Depression arrived in 1929, Britain entered the crisis already weakened by 6 years of unnecessary deflation. British unemployment, which had never fallen below 1 million during the gold standard years, rose to nearly 3 million by 1932. 1 out of every 4 British workers was unemployed. That meant families without income, children without adequate food, communities descending into poverty that would last a generation. The sovereignty that Britain lost was not political but economic. The decision to prioritize financial prestige over industrial employment shifted economic power from British factories to foreign competitors and from British workers to financial interests. The coal miners, textile workers, and steel workers who lost their jobs in the 1920s did not recover those jobs when the pound finally depreciated in 1931. The industries were gone. The markets had been captured by competitors. The workers who should have been building Britain's future instead spent their prime earning years unemployed or underemployed because policymakers valued currency prestige over productive employment. The long shadow of Churchill's decision extended far beyond the 1930s and shaped British economic development for the remainder of the 20th century. The industrial regions that were devastated by the overvalued pound never fully recovered. South Wales, northern England, and central Scotland became synonymous with industrial decline and persistent unemployment. The workers who spent the 1920s and 1930s unemployed never developed the skills and experience they would have gained in productive employment. The capital that flowed abroad during the gold standard years never returned to finance British industrial modernization. The competitive positions lost to German, American, and Japanese firms were never recaptured. The permanent damage to British industrial capacity becomes clear when we examine long-term trends. In 1870, Britain produced nearly 32% of global manufacturing output. By 1913, that figure had fallen to 14% as other nations industrialized. By 1938, after the disasters of the gold standard and the Depression, British share had fallen to 9%. The decline accelerated precisely during the period when Britain was sacrificing industry to maintain an overvalued currency. British policymakers had made a conscious choice to prioritize financial prestige over industrial strength, and the consequences lasted generations. The human cost of this policy reveals itself in the biographies of workers who lived through it. A coal miner born in 1900 might have entered the pits at age 14 in 1914, worked steadily through the war years earning decent wages, then faced unemployment or wage cuts from 1926 onward as the industry contracted. By the time he reached 40 years old in 1940, he had spent more than a decade unemployed or underemployed because policymakers insisted on maintaining a symbolic exchange rate. His children grew up in poverty. His skills atrophied. His community deteriorated. He had been sacrificed on the altar of the gold standard, and no one who made that decision ever compensated him for his loss or admitted the policy had been a mistake. The story of Britain's return to the gold standard is the ultimate lesson in the danger of prioritizing prestige over reality in economic policy. The British believed they could restore their position as the dominant economic power by restoring the symbolic exchange rate that had existed when they actually were dominant. They did not realize that currencies reflect economic strength rather than create it, and that attempting to maintain an overvalued exchange rate requires crushing domestic wages and employment in ways that destroy the productive economy. Churchill and Norman proved that the most effective way to destroy your own economy is not through war or revolution, but through monetary policy divorced from economic reality. The long shadow of this decision extends to every subsequent debate about currency values and monetary policy. The British experience in the 1920s demonstrated conclusively that exchange rates must reflect economic fundamentals rather than historical precedent or national prestige. Countries that insist on maintaining overvalued currencies pay a terrible price in unemployment and lost output. The lesson was learned at enormous cost to British workers who lost their livelihoods so that bankers could maintain symbolic exchange rates. But Britain's disaster teaches us a broader lesson about the relationship between financial policy and productive economy. The British made a fatal error in believing that policies beneficial to the City of London would benefit the nation as a whole. They assumed that a strong currency and financial prestige would create prosperity throughout the economy. They did not understand that the interests of finance and industry can diverge sharply, and that policies designed to benefit financial institutions can devastate productive sectors. The British discovered that a nation cannot prosper by sacrificing its industrial workers to maintain the convenience of its bankers. The universal truth embedded in Britain's gold standard disaster applies to any nation that confuses financial symbols with economic reality. When countries prioritize currency strength over productive employment, they impoverish their workers to maintain prestige that means nothing to families struggling to eat. Remember that Britain maintained the gold standard for 6 years, while unemployment never fell below 1 million. Remember that restoring the pound to its pre-war parity required crushing British industry and impoverishing British workers. Remember that prestige and prosperity are not the same thing, and that nations which sacrifice the latter for the former discover too late that they have destroyed the foundation of their power. Churchill himself later acknowledged the decision was the greatest mistake of his political career. The admission came too late for the miners, textile workers, and steel workers whose lives were destroyed by a policy designed to benefit bankers and preserve prestige. The monuments to British financial power still stand in London. They are built on the ruins of British industry and the suffering of workers who paid the price for Churchill's mistake. If you walk through the former industrial regions of Britain today, you will see communities that never fully recovered from the devastation of the 1920s and 1930s. The coal mines are closed. The textile mills are demolished. The steel works are silent. These regions declined not because their industries were obsolete, but because policymakers chose to sacrifice them to maintain a symbolic exchange rate. The workers who lost everything were never compensated. The mistake was never adequately acknowledged. History offers lessons to those willing to learn them. If you understand how Britain destroyed its own economy through devotion to monetary symbols rather than economic reality, you gain insight into policy mistakes that continue today. If you ignore what happened, you are destined to repeat it. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.